Hey, I'm Dan Thomas, and welcome to my channel for the Newbie Woodworker. Or anyone, really. I'm going to show you how to build this revolutionary new crosscut sled in detail, so even if you've never built anything like it before, you'll be able to build this. I call it revolutionary because unlike traditional crosscut sleds, this one works without having to remove your blade guard. And I want to start a revolution among woodworkers where using blade guards becomes more common. I figure the less often you have to switch out the blade guard, the more likely you are to keep using it. And I think that'd be a big step towards reducing the number of table saw injuries. I'd call that revolutionary. I know some of you will say, I've never used a blade guard and I've never had an accident. My response to that is,
I don't care!
Honestly, I really don't care. I mean, I'm glad you haven't had an accident, but that doesn't change the fact that people are more likely to get hurt if they don't use a blade guard. But if you don't agree with me, feel free to stop watching now. Go! For the rest of you, in a previous video I showed how to build a half sled version, so be sure to check it out if you're interested. One more thing, then we'll get started. I ran into a buttload of problems while making this video. It was frustrating, but in the end it turned out to be a good thing, because now I can help you not make the same mistakes. Anyway, don't be surprised if parts of the sled don't always look the same from one shot to another. Okay, let's get started. Cut the sled base first, so you're sure of the dimensions. This is 1/2-inch Baltic birch plywood, but any relatively flat plywood will do. And you can use 3/4 inch if you'd prefer. I'm using 1/2 inch mostly because it's lighter, and I have some. My sled will be 21 inches square, but the dimensions are pretty much arbitrary, so make your sled any dimension you want. Make the fence out of 2 pieces of 3/4 inch plywood. Make sure the plywood doesn't have a lot of voids in it, since we'll be attaching it to the base using screws. I want my fence to end up being about 3 inches tall, but I like cutting everything oversized to make the glue up easier. So I start by cutting a 6.5 inch piece. Then I cut the workpiece a little longer than the width of my sled base. If you don't have a crosscut sled yet, you can use a miter saw or chop saw if you have one, or you can attach a piece of scrap wood to a miter gauge and cut it like this. If none of those are an option, you can cut it by hand or with a circular saw. Since you'll be cutting the side of the fence, it doesn't have to be perfectly straight. As I said before, this piece is 6.5 inches tall. I set my rip fence to half of that, 3.25 inches, and split the workpiece. This gives me 2 pieces that are taller than the final 3 inches, and one of them is taller than the other by about the width of the blade. More on this in a moment. Obviously you want your fence to be as straight as possible. The plywood I'm using is slightly bowed, so I'll place the 2 pieces opposite each other so the gap is in the middle. Since the pieces aren't straight, I need to clamp them to a flat surface while the glue dries. I'm using a pair of angle irons for that. I put a clamp on each end to hold them together and to help them stand up. So I'm adding the glue, and I always end up adding too much. Better than not enough, I guess. Then I start to clamp the pieces together. Since I cut both pieces taller than necessary, I don't have to have the sides perfectly flush. I'll just trim them after the glue dries. But I still focus on keeping one side pretty close to flush. Remember I mentioned earlier that I made one side taller than the other? This is where that comes into play. I focus on keeping the squeeze out away from this edge, so after the glue dries, I'll have a nice flat edge to run against my rip fence. But for now, I set it aside to let the glue dry for a couple of hours. If you have a table saw with a tabbed miter slot, like some Craftsman and Ryobi saws have, see my video on how to make runners for them. I'm cutting my runners from plywood, but you might want to watch my full video on how to make runners. It talks about different kinds of materials and goes into more detail on the entire process. I usually use hardwood plywood, like Baltic birch, but this time I tried pine plywood. But when the rains hit and the humidity went up, the runners expanded too much. So I'm back to hardwood plywood. I started making my runners an inch or 2 shorter than my base, so if I stand the sled up against something, the runners don't hit the floor. I set my fence a little wider than my miter slot and start to cut my blanks. I make sure the first one is wider than the miter slot, then cut the rest. I like to cut a lot of runners at one time because I'm sure to need them at some point in the future. By the way, this is 1/2 inch Baltic birch plywood. I prefer to use 3/4 inch, then split it in half. But I want to use up this 1/2 inch piece. I'm not very good at moving my fence small amounts, So I made this micro adjuster gauge so I can be sure I don't move the fence too much at one time. So I tap the fence over a little and cut the end. Then I try it in the slot, and if it doesn't fit, I tap the fence over some more and try it again. And again. Just try not to cut it too thin, but if you do, turn the runner around and use the other end. Eventually I get it about right, so I cut the entire piece. And after a few tries, it's about right, so I cut the remaining pieces. This plywood is too tall for my miter slot, so I'm going to trim it down from a 1/2 inch to 3/8 of an inch. I just got this spiral featherboard from Hedgehog, and I already love it. I'm going to use this push stick, which is just about due to be replaced. I can't use my thin strip push block because the featherboard gets in the way. This kind of cut is messy, no matter what kind of dust collection you have. Because my base is square, I can have the surface grain go in any direction. So I decide to have it run this direction, which will be along the kerf. I think I like this side better, so it'll be the top. And there's an imperfection here that I'd rather have behind the fence. I did the next steps a little out of order, but I'll show it in the order you should do it. Draw arrows on the end closest to you pointing to the top. Now you'll always know this is the back of the sled, and this is the top. On the top, draw 2 lines where the fence will go. It starts at 4 inches from the back, and since my fence is about 1.5 inches thick, the front line is at 5.5 inches. Turn it over and draw the 4-inch and 5.5-inch lines, but also add one in the middle to show about where to put the screws. We're going to move on to attaching the runners, but we might add a couple more lines in a moment. There's a couple of ways to attach the runners. You can use glue or screws. Glue is probably easier, but when I have 2 runners like this, I prefer to attach them with screws because it's easy to adjust them later on if needed. So I'll show you how to do that in a moment. But first, glue. Position your rip fence so your sled's base is roughly centered over the blade. Put some nuts, washers, or spare change in the miter slots so the tops of the runners end up above the tabletop. Add glue to the runners. Don't use too much. You don't want squeeze out, and you only need a little bit of glue to hold it on. Put your base up against the rip fence and lay it down on the runners, keeping the base against the fence. Then put weights on the base and wait an hour or so before you take it off. When the glue's had time to dry, remove the sled and clean up any squeeze out. I like to sand the bottom to get it nice and smooth. Then try it out and make sure it slides okay. Mine is way too tight. I need to sand the sides of my runners a little, so I use this sanding stick I made a while back. It's basically a long handle with a replaceable block of wood that has some thick sandpaper glued on it. The sandpaper is flush against the edge, so I can sand the sides of the runners right down to the sled base. Make sure you don't sand them too much. You don't want the sled to be loose in the miter tracks. But I like to soften the edges a little to make it easier to get them in the miter tracks. I try it out again, and this time it slides great. We could also add some Johnson's paste wax when we're done if we wanted to, but not yet. In order to attach the runners with screws, we'll use the tap and drill bit set to make threaded holes in the runners. We'll drill counterbore holes in the base for machine screws and washers. The holes are oversized, so there's plenty of wiggle room. We'll make sure the screws don't stick out of the runners, or else you'll scratch your table saw top if you drag the sled around. And we'll make sure the heads are below the base, so our stock lies flat on the sled. So here's what you need. I'm using 1/4 inch machine screws a 1/2 inch long. If your base is 3/4 inch instead of 1/2 inch, you'll probably want longer screws. Washers. Like I said before, a tap and drill bit set. You can get it for less than $10 at a local hardware store. A small diameter drill bit, a 3/8 inch drill bit or some equivalent, and a 3/4 inch Forstner bit. Start out by positioning your rip fence so the base is roughly centered over the blade. Mark where the edges of the miter slots are. You don't need to be perfect, just close. And sorry this is out of focus. Turn the base over, and on the bottom, draw lines that match the marks you just made. The runners will go between these lines. Like I just said, we don't have to be dead solid perfect, since we'll be using oversized holes. I decided to sand the bottoms of the runners to get a ply that wasn't so dark so I could see my pencil marks better. Mark the right and left runner with arrows pointing to the front. I'm going to use 3 screws for each runner, so I make a mark 2 inches from either end and 1 in the center of the runner. Use a backing board and clamp down a runner so it's between the lines. Then use a small diameter bit to drill through the runner and all the way through the base. And obviously do it for both runners. Now use the drill bit that came with the tap and drill bit set and drill out the holes in the runners. You don't have to use a drill press if you don't have one, but try and get the holes as vertical as you can. Use the tap and thread the holes. Don't do it too quickly. I use a slow setting on my drill. We need to drill counterbore holes deep enough so the heads of the screws are below the surface. But not too deep. We don't want to drill all the way through the base. I'm using a 3/4 inch Forstner bit for this. Line up the point on the Forstner bit with the holes we drilled earlier. Don't press down hard at first, or the base may spin and smack you in whatever body part is at that level. I've done this enough times that I know how far to drill with my Forstner bit, but err on the side of making them too shallow. You can always drill them out more if they're not deep enough.
It was at this moment that he knew. He up.
You see, the counterbore holes are supposed to go in the top of the base, and I forgot to flip it over. Technically I could get away with this, but for this video I want it to be correct, so I cut a new base. And this time I make sure to flip it over so I'm drilling in the top of the base. Now take your 3/8 inch bit, or whatever size you're using, and drill out the rest of the holes. Then use your Forstner bit to clean out the debris. Don't actually press down and drill, just clean up anything that sticks up inside the counterbore. Make sure all the screws will be below the surface of the base. If not, fix it now. The runners go on the bottom, obviously. This is my right runner, and I've got the arrow pointing to the front of the sled. Set it over the holes, and turn the base over. Then line up the screw holes and add the screws and washers. Get the other runner pointed in the right direction, then flip it over, put it under the sled, and add the screws and washers. If you forget to flip it over, chances are that some of the holes won't line up. Double check that the screws are below the surface of the base. If not, drill them out a little more with the Forstner bit. Also, double check that they don't stick out below the bottom of the runners, or you'll scratch your table saw. Now take it over to the table saw, put it in the miter slots, and loosen all the screws. Once the screws are loose, and some people say my screws are already loose, if it doesn't slide smoothly, you'll probably need to sand the edges of one or both runners a little. This part is optional, but I like to slide my fence over next to my base to square it up. I also try and position it so that if I need to, I can adjust the runners to both the right and the left. Then tighten the screws for one runner and make sure it still slides okay. If it doesn't, mess around with it until it does. Then start tightening the screws for the other runner, double checking to make sure the sled doesn't start binding. If it does, loosen the screw and try it again. Hopefully by now, the glue on the fence has had enough time to dry, so unclamp the fence. I checked to make sure it came out straight, and it did. Like I said earlier, we should have one side that's nice and flat, with no squeeze out. But if it has squeeze out, clean it off. Put that side against your rip fence, and trim the other side to get it square, and remove any squeeze out. Then put that side against the fence, and trim the other side. And finally, trim the ends to get them even and clean. If you ended up with your fence being wider than your base, cut it down to size now. Again, you could also use a miter saw or chop saw, or a miter gauge, or cut it by hand. Since it's the ends of the fence, it doesn't have to be perfect. Before we attach the fence, we need to cut the kerf so we have something to align the fence to. We've already drawn lines where the fence will go, and we'll cut the kerf down to the front line. I noticed the sled was binding a little, so I'm adjusting the runner screws. From now on, if you need to adjust the screws, only adjust one side. You don't want to misalign the sled. So as long as you keep one side the same, you should be fine. Like I said in the previous build video, use some good quality screws, like Spax or GRK or Torx. We'll be driving them in and removing them several times, and these screws are great for that. I never noticed this on the bottom of the package before. Since I never do anything right the first time, I wonder if this means I'm not allowed to use these screws. Anyway, we're going to attach the fence with one screw on the end first, so we can pivot the fence to align it. Since I'm right-handed, if the fence pivots on this side, it'll be easier for me to align. So pick whichever side works best for you, flip over the base, and punch a mark on the middle line about an inch or so in. Figure out what's the best side to use as the front of your fence. I don't want to use this side because of this crap I got on it. I could just sand it off, but it's not a good idea to sand the front of your fence because it probably won't be perfectly flat anymore. Don't ask how I know. I kind of used this fence before. You can see where I patched the old screw holes. It already has a partial kerf, and I don't want to try to line up the kerfs, so I'll make this the top instead. We're going to cut this part out later anyway. Draw some arrows so you remember which way it goes. Get some pieces of scrap wood or something you can prop up the front of the base with. I'm actually using parts of the fence from a previous build attempt. Position your fence upside down, with the front facing away from you, and put it under the base. Line it up between the lines. You don't have to be perfect here, just close. Then clamp it down. Spax screws say you don't need to drill pilot holes, but for this application, we do. These screws are 2 inches long, and this countersink bit isn't long enough. This one is long enough, but it's too big. So I'll need to use a regular bit to drill the pilot hole. I'm using a caliper to figure out what diameter bit to use. I measure in between the threads, and it's 7/64 of an inch. No wisecracks from you metric guys. Yes, I'm dealing with 64ths of an inch. If you don't have a caliper, you can take a bit and hold the shank in front of the screw to see if the threads stick out far enough. This is a 1/8 inch bit, and it's a little too large for soft pine plywood. So like I said, I'm using a 7/64 inch bit. Since the bit is about the right length, I put it in the drill so I can just drill down until it hits the jaws. So I drill the pilot hole, then use the countersink bit to drill the countersink. Make sure it's deep enough so the screw head is below the surface. And there you go. It pivots just like we want. I mentioned in a previous video that you can align the fence to the blade, but it turns out that's not as accurate as it sounds. It's too complicated to go into here, so either take my word for it, or don't. If enough people leave a comment asking for an explanation, I'll write a blog article. So check my website before you leave a comment. So, in this video, we'll align the fence to the kerf using a straight edge of some kind and a square. So let's get started. I just put out a video about an easy way to cut thin strips on your table saw, and that's what I'm doing here, cutting thin strips until I get one with the Goldilocks fit in my kerf. If you don't want to do that, you can take a ruler, like this one from my combination square, and add painter's tape to it until you get a tight fit. Make sure the tape doesn't have wrinkles. This one took 9 strips of tape. Put the straight edge in the kerf. Leave some room at the bottom for the fence to move around. Then use a square that you know actually is square to pivot the fence until it's square to the straight edge. If you're using the taped ruler method, check against the side without the tape. I'm using my precision square here, but that ends up being a mistake, as you'll see in a moment. It turns out you need to use something longer. Once you think the fence is square, clamp it down. If you line up your clamp down the length of the fence, it's less likely to pull the fence offline when you tighten it down. Double check that it's still square, then flip it over and drill and drive a screw. Double check that it's still square. It looked right with the precision square, but I wanted some footage using the framing square. When the framing square showed it wasn't aligned properly, I ignored it. I'd tell you it was a mistake to ignore it, except I'm glad I did, because I ended up showing that the smaller square is less accurate here. Once you get the screw in, cut a scrap piece and check it for square. Sure enough, mine wasn't square, but now I had a good idea why. So I took out the screw and realigned the fence using the framing square. I drilled a new hole, marked the old hole so I wouldn't use it by mistake later on, and added the screw. Still looks square, so I got that going for me. I make another cut and it's perfect. So, lesson learned, use a longer square for this kind of aligning. If you can't seem to get it perfectly square, remember that this is woodworking, and unless it's off by a lot, it probably won't matter. Measure how much room the blade guard needs to one side of the blade. I can probably get by with a little over an inch, but I'll call it 1 1/4 inches to make sure I don't cut it too narrow, which is a mistake I made on one of the prototype sleds. Make sure you've got the kerf at least part way into the fence, because we're going to use it for measuring. We want at least 3 screws on each side of the kerf, so pick out where they should go. But remember that we'll be cutting out a notch for the blade guard. The screws need to be far enough in from the kerf so they don't stick out into the notch. So mark where the sides of the notch will go. Then take that into account as you mark where to drill the holes. Drill the countersunk holes, making sure they're deep enough so the heads of the screws will be below the surface. Drive the screws and sand off the splinters if needed. Again, make sure the screws are deep enough. Now, unscrew all the screws to remove the fence. Use the kerf to measure and mark where the notch will go on each side. We're going to leave 3/4 of an inch at the bottom of the fence, so draw lines where to cut the notch. Extend them across the top and draw matching lines on the other side. I'm just double checking that since this is the top, this is where the blade guard goes, and this is where the back of the stock gets supported. Good, I marked everything okay. So now we need to cut this out. And eventually this will get cut all the way through, so we'll take advantage of that by cutting it in half ourselves. You could cut it all using a handsaw, or even a jigsaw with a long plywood cutting blade. But I'm going to show you how to do it on the table saw using a miter gauge. Attach a piece of wood to your miter gauge, like I mentioned near the start of the video. Lay your fence on the side and set the blade height. Then line up the kerf with the blade, clamp the fence, and cut it in half. Now set one of the fence halves on its top and set the blade height so it's just short of the line. Then position it so you'll be cutting on the correct side of the line. I should mention that we're doing non-through cuts here, which means the blade isn't cutting all the way through the stock. So make sure you don't have anything that can get in the way, like my blade guard spreader would. I can use my riving knife though, because it's just shy of the top of my blade. Once you're sure you're safe, make the cut. And then cut the other piece of the fence the same way. Again, make sure you're cutting it on the right side of the line. Now stand it on end and set the blade height for the other cut. Oh, and make sure you're cutting the right side of the line. Now you know why I keep saying that. And there's one piece. I didn't cut it perfectly, but I'll just chisel out the rest. Then cut the other piece. My two pieces aren't the same length because I didn't get my sled perfectly centered over the blade. No big deal to me, but your level of OCD will determine if it matters to you or not. Just a reminder, don't sand the front of the fence, especially if it's softwood like pine plywood. I made that mistake and ended up with one side of the fence not lining up with the other. The next step is to add a chamfer to the fence. Make sure you add it to the front of the fence on the bottom. A chamfer is a roughly 45-degree cut at the bottom of the fence that helps keep sawdust from getting between the fence and the stock. I'm using my belt sander, but you could cut it with a chamfer router bit, or make a miter cut on the table saw, use a hand plane, or even sand it by hand. Once I'm done with the chamfers, I smooth out the ends and the tops. Then I round over all the edges and corners except the bottom of the fence or the 3/4 inch section. Don't forget to chisel out any extra wood in the notch if you need to. Don't learn how to use chisels from watching me. I'm literally a hack when it comes to using chisels. Here's the results. Looking at it closely, I guess I should do some final hand sanding. Not that it matters, since it's just a sled. It's time to reattach the fence. I sanded off the arrows on the fence parts, but I can use the chamfers to know how to position the pieces. Assuming I know the top from the bottom. Set the fence pieces under the base, but inside the screw holes. Then start all the screws so they stick out a little on the bottom. Something like this. Start with one side of the fence and get the existing holes lined up with the screws. Take your time and get it right. You might need to make the screw tips stick out further. Once you're sure it's lined up right, set your drill's clutch to a low setting and start driving the screws slowly. Feel for any resistance because if you missed a hole, the screw could easily start a new hole without you noticing it. Once you're sure you haven't started new holes, you can change your clutch and finish driving the screws. Then do the same for the other side. Alright, let's see how well it works. Raise up your blade so the sled will fit under the blade guard, and make sure the blade guard fits through the notch easily. If not, you may have to cut the notch bigger. Cut a piece of scrap wood and check for a square cut. And, as expected, it works just like it did before. If it doesn't, you most likely reattached the fence without correctly lining up the existing holes with the screws. Or you ignored my warning and sanded the front of the fence. In either case, you may have to redo some, if not all, of the sled. But don't feel bad, you're not alone. The last thing to do is add the rear support piece. Maybe. You might not need it. I need it to keep my blade guard sides from dropping down behind the fence. Originally, I was also thinking it would add support to the back of the sled. Since you'll be taking the sled off and putting it back on many times, I was concerned it might start to split here. But now I think that as long as you don't let the kerf go too far past the fence, it probably won't be a problem. So it's up to you if you want to add it or not. But since I do need it, here's how to do it. Measure the back of the sled. Mine is a little over 4 inches, and since you want a little room between the support piece and the fence, I'll call it 4 inches exact. Use your new sled to cut a piece of 3/4 inch plywood to the length you just measured. Make the width around 4 inches also. Then glue it on. Don't put it directly against the fence. We don't want to push the fence out of alignment. And as usual, I put way too much glue on. One of these days I'll learn. When you clamp it down, be careful how you clamp it. Don't clamp it to a workbench or anything like that, or you'll warp it, like I did. Just clamp the two pieces of plywood together. And then let it dry for a couple of hours. I did a little bit of fine sanding on the bottom, then applied some Johnson's paste wax. I used to hate using wax because the smell would stick around for weeks, but I learned it's actually the rag that smells, so now I keep the rag in the can. Much better. And there it is. When you take the sled off your table saw, do it like this. Tilt it backwards, then lift. If you just pull it straight out, you'll have a tendency to turn it while the runners are still in the slot, and you can break the ends or possibly even knock them out of alignment. So like I said, just tilt and lift. I hope this video helps you build this sled and to start using your blade guard more regularly. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. Don't forget to check out the product and video links in the description below or on my website. If you buy from my product links, it doesn't cost you any extra, and it helps my channel a little. So thanks. You can also help by clicking the thumbs up. It actually helps a lot. If you like what I do here, consider subscribing, and don't forget to ring that bell to get notified when I release new videos. Thanks.